Hey friend, welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast or YouTube channel. I've got something really special for you today, a full session recording from Tudorcon 2024 featuring the brilliant Samantha Bullat. Samantha's a dress historian based in Williamsburg, Virginia, where she works as a tailor for the Jamestown-Yorktown Federation. She combines her meticulous historical research with stunning hands-on craftsmanship. And in this talk, she takes us deep into the luxurious world of royal Tudor clothing. Specifically, we're diving into the wardrobe of Anne Boleyn based on actual fabric and clothing receipts from the final years of her life. Samantha walks us through the fabrics, colors, construction techniques, what Anne's clothing can tell us about her personality, and yes, she even gets into why Tudor women didn't wear underwear. This was a real treat to watch in person, so settle in and enjoy Samantha's talk, Dressing a Queen, the Royal Robes of Anne Boleyn. If you love this talk, you can still come to Tudorcon 2025, where we're going to have more talks like this. We've got a handful of in-person spots left for our weekend 3-day celebration of all things Tudor at the gorgeous Agecroft Hall, a real Tudor manor house brought over from England. And of course, if you can't travel, no worries, you can join from home with our Tudorcon From Home ticket, enjoy all of the live stream sessions, exclusive bonus content, and a lively online community of fellow Tudor fans. Grab your ticket now before we sell out. englandcast.com/TudorCon to come in person, englandcast.com/TudorCon from home to come online. All right, let's turn it over to Samantha's talk.
Probably many of you, and I think many other people in the world, I have been captivated by Anne Boleyn since I was young, very young. I did a project on her in 8th grade where we got to focus on one historical person, and I wanted to dress up like her. And ever since then, I've wanted to recreate this portrait in particular of Anne's clothing, or the way that she's depicted here. And it was only recently that I felt that I really had the skills and the knowledge to do that in the way that I wanted to. My work as a tailor for the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation is as much about making clothing as it is research. So I consider myself a dress historian as well as a maker, because I think that having accurate clothing, whether it's at my work or for myself, is as important as the information that I'm conveying and talking about. So the research is very important to me, the materials, the construction techniques, that sort of thing. But one of the difficulties of studying images of Anne's visual appearance, is that all of the portraits that we have of her today are either posthumous copies of portraits that probably existed or that were made during her lifetime. So this one, which is my favorite, is a later, probably mid-16th century copy of a portrait of her. And there are other versions of this. There are some possible Holbein sketches. There's the most happy medal, which is in very poor condition, but at least was made during her lifetime, but we don't get a lot of detail there. So in trying to figure out, get that sort of connection to her, you can look at other sources that weren't necessarily visual. And one of those sources is this account, materials that were purchased for Anne and as well as her daughter from a man named William Locke, who's the Queen's mercer. And a mercer is a merchant who specifically deals in high quality imported textiles, often silk, but sometimes fine linen. And they can also sell small dress accessories or sewing supplies. And as Brigitte was saying, merchants are really coming into their own in this period. And William Locke did very well for himself. He came from a family of mercers. So his father and his grandfather before him were mercers. And in March of 1527, he was granted exclusive license to import silks, jewels, and mercery wares for court revels. And the wealth that he had accumulated as a merchant by 1535 is indicated by the fact that he was valued at about £1,000. So, yeah. And I do want to call attention to the dates of these receipts. It is from the 20th of January in 1535 to the 27th of April, 1537. So those of you who are familiar with Anne's stories will recognize how close that is to the end of her life, which I find interesting that up until the end, she was still being arrayed as a queen until the bitter end. So what the accounts tell us are the garments, the textiles, the colors of a part of Anne's wardrobe, which allows us to sort of visualize at least what Anne would have looked like from here, from the neck down. And, you know, I find that clothing, food, these create very strong connections with us to people in the past because it is a very personal experience. You recreate recipes so that you can taste them and for a moment taste what somebody might have eaten in the 16th century. And for me, to make the garments using materials as close as I can allows me both the physical, the visual experience of what Anne might have felt physically wearing the clothing, seen what she would have chosen, her personal taste as well, because we all have a personal connection with the clothes that we wear. If we don't care about fashion, that is still a personal connection that you have to your clothing. And so we get that glimpse. And I think in a time where it's rare to have the personal insights written down of women of all class, having this gives us that little insight. So in these accounts from William Locke, over that period, these are the garments that are listed here that she has. So in terms of gowns, the outer garment, she either has 16 that were made or 10. And the reason there are two numbers for some of these categories is that the way that the accounts are written, some of them might be referencing the same garment to say like, well, I need silk for this, for the lining of this gown, and I need, you know, buckram for the interlining of this gown. Most of the time they will say for the same gown or for the above gown. But sometimes they don't. But just to be safe, she either had 16 gowns during that period or 10 gowns made. She also has kirtles, nightgowns, partlets, pairs of sleeves, shoes, slippers, and cloaks. And I will get into each of these separately. But I just think it's interesting to note the numbers that are here. It's quite a bit of clothing. When you consider that, you know, common people, you know, would definitely not have this much. This is literally the highest female position in the land. And these are the numbers that she has, at least from these accounts. So we can consider that she undoubtedly has even more in her full wardrobe. But these are all very typical female garments for an elite status woman to have. There's nothing here that's really unusual, and nothing that really she's missing, at least in terms of garments that could be made from silk. Because remember, the Mercer is specifically dealing in high quality imported silk fabrics and some linen or other fabrics, but primarily silk is what we're looking at. Which means that there's a good bit missing here that would be made from other fabrics, particularly linen, which would be all of her undergarments, meaning her smock, which is a full-length linen garment here. It would have reached to probably mid-calf and protected her outer clothing from the dirt and oil, the dirt and oils of the body from getting on the clothes. So the linen garment, whether it's a coif, which would say we're in England, linen coif over her hair, to protect it from the oils of her hair on any headdresses. Those things are linen, so they wouldn't necessarily show up here. And so those are a major thing that is not in this list. Just really the silk things. So there's also something in here which you might be wondering about. Does anybody have a guess what isn't here that you might expect to see? Underpants. Okay, so underpants is a good one. Yes, women basically up until the 19th century did not regularly wear any kind of what we think of as underpants. The smock covers your whole body. There's reason to have a bifurcated garment. There are some survivors that are Italian, so there's possibly more of an Italian cultural connection to wearing them. I believe there's imagery of courtesans wearing them in Italy, but they are not common for women because there's really no need. And I invite everybody to come up, touch the gown. I really don't mind. When you consider the weight of all of this, it is much easier to use the bathroom when there isn't anything else to deal with other than lifting up the skirt. But there is definitely a cultural connection about sort of that vulnerability of women as well. And you see that in paintings, in texts and that sort of thing, is that sort of connotation. What else is missing that you might expect to see in a Tudor wardrobe? Stockings. Yeah, so stockings could have been made and then purchased through some smaller mercer, like a haberdasher, someone who deals more in those kinds of accessories. Mercers, even though some of them could sell that, William Locke just didn't. Anybody else? Yep, so there's no headwear in here. Again, there are so many different trades who are creating clothing during this period. So headwear could come from silk women. There really aren't necessarily milliners at this time period. There are people who make hats. There are hatters who are primarily dealing in felt, but a lot of the fabric garments, headwear could come from silk women who are focusing on making little silk trims and things, or just seamstresses who are making these things. Anybody else? Petticoats. Yeah, there is a surprising lack of petticoats in here, which I find interesting and sort of unusual because petticoats for women start to become more common at the beginning of the 16th century. Prior to that, you don't see them. It is kirtle and gown. But the one I'm looking for is farthingale. There's no farthingales listed. And that's really because even though a lot of people like to throw around, oh, well, Catherine of Aragon brought them to England and they were all the rage, they actually weren't. They were seen as a very like sort of strange Spanish thing. And when Catherine was coming here, she's now an English queen. So she's adopting English fashion. And the first time that we see a farthingale recorded in the Great Wardrobe, which is responsible for clothing the royal household, isn't until 1545. So well past Anne, and that farthingale is recorded as being purchased for Elizabeth. So they really aren't that common in the 1530s. It's really in the 1540s, everything gets wider. Skirts get wider, sleeves get a lot wider. And so here, this is probably like a 1520s Holbein. She isn't wearing a farthingale under her gown. But the gown is the outer garment worn by women of all classes. Even though we say the word gown, it doesn't denote, wedding gown or evening gown. They just don't use dress in the way that we use dress today. Dress is a whole genre of clothing. It's morning dress to wear in the morning or evening dress to wear in the evening, or I'm getting dressed. Gown refers to a garment. And men also wear gowns. They're just loose and they could be hip length, they could be floor length, but lots of people wear gowns. They're just an outer garment. The kirtle is the sort of structural support that is worn underneath. For centuries before the 16th century, the kirtle was a woman's basic garment. And over time, it became a little more structured in the bodice, or what they called the bodies or upper bodies. And at the time of the Tudors, we don't see, particularly, Henry VIII and the wives, we don't see boning being used. Yeah, that won't really come in until the late 16th century, about the 1580s. So what they're using to stiffen the bodies of gowns and kirtles is different layers of wool and linen that are quilted together. They can also use buckram, either paste buckram, which is like a coarse linen fabric that has, paste applied to it to make it stiff. And that is what they're using, the quilted layers to stiffen the bodies of kirtles. And kirtles are probably where the jeweled neckline comes from that is seen in portraits. And the bottom part of the kirtle can either be shown directly, or you could have a separate forepart that is attached to the front to change out the look there. And we know from both written records, including William Locke's receipt, as well as surviving garments, that oftentimes the parts that show are of a much more expensive fabric, and the parts underneath that are hidden by the gown are made of a less expensive fabric, even at the rank of someone like Anne. They're still, they're flaunting their wealth, but they still want to save a little money where they can, so they can spend it other places. There's no reason to go too crazy. Anne also has a number of nightgowns that come up in this receipt. And they are not sleeping garments the way that we think of nightgowns today. They are just a more casual garment. It is this unfitted loose gown that both Christina of Denmark and Catherine Parr are wearing here, and numerous other ladies from the time period. So just slightly more casual. You kind of think of it as our athleisure. You can spend just as much on athleisure as you can on nice clothing today, and it's very much the same way. You can have an extremely luxurious nightgown. It just means it's informal, as much as you can be informal in Tudor times. The partlet is this black little piece here that goes over the shoulders and covers up this neckline. And I'll speak from experience that even though this gown, and when it was, fully lined in fur with all the different layers, if you have this exposed, it's still very cold. And so the partlet can help fill in this neckline here. It just creates a different look, changes it up a little bit, but also provides a little bit of extra warmth. And it does make a big difference in your temperature, absolutely. But they are usually black. And Anne's are both black velvet and black satin. This one here is black. That's the most common color. It's not the only color for partlets like these, but it is certainly the most common. Now I'm going to, oh, I didn't do it right. Oh, it was command. Okay. So instead of me getting dressed like I did in the first Tudorcon, I figured it was easier if I just filmed myself and then showed you. So this red layer here is a petticoat. I wanted to have one. Oh, can we turn that down just a little bit? And petticoats are very, very commonly red. As Brigitte was saying, with the idea of balancing the humors and health, red was seen as a very warm, healthy color to have close to the body. So women had red petticoats. Men could also have a red petticoat. Men's petticoats were like a vest that could be worn under the doublet. And next I'm wearing, putting the kirtle on here. The kirtle laces on both sides, and I usually leave one side fully closed and then laced on the other to make it easier for me to get in, but it makes it slightly adjustable. And also that way, this jeweled neckline remains completely unbroken. So there's no lacing here because it laces at the side, you get the jewels all the way around unbroken. And there's my Melusine tattoo. For those of you who were at the inaugural Tudorcon, I have a Melusine tattoo because of that. Here I'm putting on my, my French hood, and this is a whole other talk that I do about my research into the form of French hoods, how they actually aren't a crescent moon on your head, but are a folded fabric that comes out of earlier hoods from the medieval period. And that could be for Tudorcon 2025. But this is putting that on here. It's 2 layered. So there's that black silk cap that I'm wearing underneath, and then the actual velvet hood that's worn on top. And hoods, the actual hood part is almost always black in the Tudor period. The cap can be different colors, and the lining of the hood that gets folded back can be different colors, but it's usually white or red tends to be that. So the gown is kind of put on like a coat because it opens up in the front. And the sleeves, which is why you see pairs of sleeves in the Locke accounts, are separate and tied in here with ties at the arm side, so that you can switch out different looks. And because the upper arm of the sleeve is so fitted and this is so voluminous, it keeps things from getting too bulky around that tight upper arm. So here I am lacing the four bodies of the gown, and I could leave that loosely laced if I was pregnant. You see that in the family of Thomas More portrait. A lot of women have the front of their gowns open, but in this case, I'm covering it with a placard, and this placard happens to be matching, and it pins on both sides to the garment. There are references even in Locke's account of placards for Anne, and of course, I had to have the necklace. So the placard helps give just a completely smooth look to the front. And you can see the pins on quite a few Holbein portraits. They're there on the sides as well. And so it's just another level of adjustability. Even for elite women, you know, you're still changing size, whether that's from multiple pregnancies. And so, yeah. And so you have this adjustability from, you know, you can lace it a little looser and the placard is still going to give you a certain amount of coverage, or you can just say no placard and just have the lacing, or as in the Thomas More family portrait, a lot of them just tie as well. So we have the garments that Anne wore. Now here are the colors of the garments that are in the receipts of the different fabrics that were purchased. And one of the things that really stands out the most is that this is a surprisingly limited color palette, I think, than what we might expect. Or even when we think about what is available today or what's in our own wardrobes, there's actually a fairly limited color palette here. And unfortunately, we have the 6.9% that's unspecified. But I would wager that it was probably one of these that actually are listed here. And the majority of them are Black. But this limited color palette is very consistent with what most often appears both in portraiture and in other written accounts from this time period, which suggests that these are the Pantone colors of the year. And they have been the Pantone colors of the Tudor year since the late 15th century. And in the great wardrobe of Henry VII, and from Henry VIII's time with Catherine, so from 1485 to 1520, this same breakdown of Black, tawny, crimson, and russet are the top four colors from that period, and they are similarly the top four colors in Anne's purchases here. So I find it very interesting that it actually lined up perfectly of Black, tawny, crimson, and russet. So she is just carrying on this, I wouldn't say tradition, but this trend, really, of the colors that are fashionable. And I wish you had brought these with you. I would love to see them. So I can imagine, yes, yeah. Yeah, so Brigitte and Tom have these beautifully made by Nina Michaela. But Black is obviously my favorite color, but it is still an incredibly fashionable and desirable color. But for the people of the 16th century and into the 17th century, Black is a color of sobriety and wealth and power. Today, I think we just jump to Puritan or, you know, dour Catholics, but it was truly a color that conveyed wealth and power, or an aspiration to wealth and power, because everybody, even though they knew their place, you still hoped for better. And even if you were a common person, you still might want to have a Black partlet or a Black hat as part of your aspirational leanings there. But part of the reason, I should say, that Black is so desirable is that it is difficult to get a true rich Black from natural sources on fabrics during this time, and truly until the 19th century when you get synthetic dyes. Initially, they're using plants that contain tannins in them, So alder, walnut, or chestnut, and it's essentially the recipe for gall oak dye. It is tannins and then iron salts as a mordant, and mordants help the dyes stick to the fabric on a molecular level. But because there's that iron salt in there, well, what happens to iron? It rusts, and it's very corrosive to the fabric. So it doesn't last very long. It'll still fade. They call them rusty blacks in the 19th century when they're still dealing with this issue where as it fades, it'll turn that brownish. And if you've ever seen an antique black garment, you'll see the sun just causes it to turn brown, and you lift up the arm and it's still black under there, but it's brownish everywhere else. On surviving pieces of black work, they could be completely actually eaten away where the actual black silk threads were if they haven't just faded. And using iron as a mordant was called a saddening mordant because it created a sad or darker color. A much stronger but more expensive and complicated way to achieve black was using madder and woad overdyed with tannins again. And by the late 16th century, they are putting the fabric into woad and then overdying it with madder. So they're using multiple processes, multiple dyes to get those very true deep blacks. But of course, sheep naturally come in black. And so you could have sheep's color black as well if you were further down the social scale. Crimson is, again, the second most common color for these elite women. And initially, it comes from kermes, which are a type of scale bug. They're a parasite that grow on the kermes oak in the Mediterranean. And it takes a lot of the kermes insects. They are tiny, tiny, tiny. So much so that they're referred to as grains because they look like grains of wheat or grains of sand. And fabric that was dyed crimson with kermes, and you'll notice the crimson and kermes connection is not a coincidence. It's considered to be dyed in grain or in the grain because they're called grain. So if you ever see in Tudor accounts engrained cloth, that's what it means, that it is bright crimson dyed with kermes, and it's very expensive. But kermes eventually becomes replaced with something we are probably more familiar with, which is cochineal, which we still use today in a lot of cosmetic and food applications. And cochineal is also an insect, also very tiny, also a parasite, but it comes from Mexico, Central America, and they are tiny parasites that live on cacti. So you have to scrape them off of the cacti petals, and because it's coming from as far away as Mexico, Central America, it's, again, very expensive source, but it creates a stronger and more vibrant red than kermes could. So as soon as that becomes available, that really overtakes kermes, but still very expensive. There is white in Anne's wardrobe, and she does have a number of white gowns, white kirtles, and this was a nice example of that, again, with her red sleeves. Tawny is this color here. It's often considered like the color of a lion, that kind of goldish, brownish color there. Purple, and I think we all have these ideas about purple and royalty. And we mentioned sumptuary laws a little bit earlier. Some of Henry's sumptuary laws stated that no person of what estate, condition, or degree that he be use in his apparel any cloth of gold or purple color, or silk of purple color, but only the king, the queen, the king's mother, the king's children, the king's brothers and sisters. So anybody who is royal, not that you couldn't wear the color purple. It wasn't the idea of purple that was restricted to the king, because you can get purple in things that aren't specifically cloth of gold, purple, or purple silk. So you could have a purple color wool. It just can't specifically be silk or cloth of gold, and the purple itself is important. So you can have cheap sources of purple. You could use madder and woad, which are madder root, fairly cheap, is going to give you red. Woad, fairly cheap is going to give you blue. So you could have a purple or probably violet, they would call it, wool, and that's fine. You're not going to get slapped with a fine or anything like that. But purple, using, again, kermes or cochineal to get the red, and then woad over that to get the blue to create purple, that is what would be restricted to the royal family, but again, only in silks and only in cloth of gold. So it's not as far reaching as I think we've been led to believe over the years of thinking only, only the king and the royal family can wear purple. It's not quite as strict as that. And I think you've probably heard of Tyrian purple, which was used as far back as, well, even before ancient Rome, and that was restricted to only the emperor. But by the fall of Constantinople, it's pretty much impossible to get the Tyrian purple, which was from sea snails. You don't have any more access to that after the fall of Constantinople. So the Pope actually says, we're not going to have Tyrian purple anymore for, I believe it was cardinals, which is why they switched over to the red that is so well known now as that cardinal color. And finally, russet, which is a sort of elusive color to us today. It's probably a sort of orangish brown, whereas tawny was more of a yellow brown. But russet can be confusing because in the 16th century, russet is also a fabric. So you have to read into the context clues whether it's talking about russet, the color, or russet, the fabric. Russet as a fabric would probably never have shown up in Anne Boleyn's wardrobe because it is a very coarse, basic wool cloth or wool fabric. And it is very common among the laboring classes. Farm workers are going to appear a lot in russet. It doesn't go through a lot of processing, which makes it very cheap. And it's often left a natural sheep's color. So the whole range of sheep that you can imagine, that's what russet fabric is. So you have to read, are they talking about, russet velvet, in which case it's a russet colored velvet, or is it russet colored russet, in which case it's a brownish, orangish wool fabric. And I realize I have to point it out because, of course, oh, you can't. We're missing some. Cloth of gold is up there above tissue. You just can't see it. And I realized Bruges satin made it in twice. I do apologize for that for folks who are sticklers on their accurate datum. Just know it is killing me as well. But if we look at this spread, these are all of the fabrics that show up for outer garments. I left out things that were linings or interlinings because, again, I was trying to get a sense of the visual here, not necessarily the construction. So these are, we've got all of the, literally the finest fabrics available in the Tudor world at the time. And we will go through them now. Oh, let me see if I can. Oop. Amazing. So as we talk about the fabrics, first I want to discuss, there's a difference between fiber, which is what the fabric is made out of, and the weave, which is how the fibers are woven. Velvet is a weave, and you can have velvet made out of any number of things. Today we have cotton velvet, we have rayon velvet, we have rayon silk velvet, we have polyester velvet. So velvet is just a weave. In the 16th century, however, the word velvet specifically means silk velvet. And so again, silk velvet is the second most costly fabric in the Tudor world. And so it is very restricted to who can wear velvet of any kind. Below knights, you're pretty much not really supposed to wear it, except in like trims and little accessories. But as full garments, it is very restricted. And velvet is created, you have, when you weave, the warp, which is the length of the whole fabric. So you have threads running vertically, the warp threads, and you have weft threads, which run horizontally, and those interweave to create the fabric. So you have here, we've got warp, and then we have the weft, but we also have extra threads here, which are these loops. And when those get cut, they create what we know of as the velvet pile, that fuzzy part. But you don't have to cut the loops. You can leave them as loops, which is very, very rare today, but was quite common in the 16th century to create patterns within the velvet. You could leave areas that had loops and areas that were cut. It's just called cut and uncut velvet, and it creates beautiful patterns. But that's extra threads that's woven in there. So it is extremely time consuming. And the way that they weave velvet, to get the loops, they insert tiny metal rods that the threads pass over. So very time consuming. It takes multiple people to weave that. And this is, although it is past technically the time period, well, it's past the period of Anne, it is still within Tudor in general, a surviving 16th century Italian gown from probably the 50s or 60s. So velvet, as I mentioned, when it's just velvet, is silk velvet. But we do see something called kaffa show up in garments for Anne and her daughter Elizabeth. And kaffa is a type of velvet that has a pattern woven into it, probably through cut and uncut loops, or areas where there is no pile next to areas where there is a pile. But kaffa uses cheaper fibers, possibly wool or linen, to be the ground so that you can save the expensive pile as the silk. So you save a little bit of money there. And they differentiate that through the name kaffa, or sometimes it's kaffoy as well. So I think it's interesting that it even still shows up in clothing for Anne and Elizabeth. So they weren't, again, above saving a little money. Velvet used for gowns and kirtles, but velvet was also used for a technique called edging, which is, you can see this solid edging here that goes around the neckline. And then it's actually, these are the ends of her sleeves because her sleeves are folded back. So the ends of her sleeves are also edged in velvet. And you can see in some portraits also the front opening of the skirt will be edged in velvet, and it can go all around. So the edging is essentially a binding that goes on all of those edges, which is why it's called edging. But velvet is really the main fabric that is used for that practice, that form of trim. And it is usually complementary to the fabric. So this is a red, most likely damask gown, but it could be a patterned velvet, and it has red edging. Princess Elizabeth's portrait from the 1540s is probably red cloth of gold, and it has red edging on it. That is most likely velvet. This is Genoa velvet, which comes from Genoa, Italy. Genoa, Venice, Florence were all major velvet silk production centers, and they still are today. In Venice, I think there's one of the only remaining velvet weaving companies that will still do anything like this actually out of silk. And it, of course, is hundreds and hundreds of dollars a yard, a meter, I guess I should say. And the thing about Genoa velvet is that it has this pattern woven into it. There's only velvet pile in certain places. The rest of this ground here, in this instance, it is a white ground that has a satin weave, and I'll get into that in a moment. But you can see here, this is an example of the cut and uncut pile. So this richer color, the darker red is where the pile has been cut, and the lighter is where the loops have been left. And you can actually see that it is still looped there. So this is what we can imagine when we think or read about accounts of Genoa velvet in Anne's wardrobe. Damask shows up a lot. I think we use damask and jacquard and brocade fairly interchangeably today. But in the 16th century, damask specifically, again, is a weave. So you could have wool damask. The weave is this pattern that is woven into the fabric as opposed to embroidered on or printed on or something like that. The pattern is woven into the fabric. And specifically for damasks, damasks are woven often tone on tone, but not always. But they are essentially reversible. It may not look as good on the reverse, but it doesn't have any kind of just random floaty threads on the back. It is as neat on one side as the other. And that is kind of what differentiates damask from other fabrics, which might have extra threads woven in to create a design, but the backside won't be as pretty, essentially. This kind of swirling vine pattern or pomegranate pattern is incredibly fashionable in the 15th, 16th centuries. And you see over time, from essentially the late 15th century through to the end of the 16th century, the fashion for the size of the damask gets smaller and smaller. They move away from really big patterns and they get to really small patterns by the end of the 16th century. So satin is another one where satin is the weave, and we can see here the very typical, very basic plain woven fabric is just over, under, over, under. Twill fabrics, the weft thread will skip over one of the warp threads instead of going evenly over, under, over, under. And then in a satin, you're skipping a bunch of threads. And that skipping it is what creates this very liquid, soft, floating surface, which of course means the chance of snagging it and ruining it is very high, but it's all in that weave of having these offset wefts. And even though these ones are skipped, these threads are so close together that they actually kind of cover that so it looks continuous and soft. So satin, unless it is specifically called out as something else, is always silk satin. But Bruges satin could be wool and silk, again, where wool is the warp threads that are getting covered up by these silk weft threads. So you won't see the wool that's under there, just like with the Kaffa velvet, but it is a way to get something cheaper that still looks nice. So cloth of gold or cloth of silver and tissue is the absolute most expensive, most highly prized fabric that you could have had in the Tudor period. They're the fabrics that get used for coronation clothing, for royalty across Europe. And that's because it is literally made with gold or silver, metal. And in this instance here, like I mentioned, so what would purple cloth of gold look like? If you imagine where all of the green here is as being purple, that would be purple cloth of gold. So it is gold and purple woven in this design. So when they're weaving with metal, it is often a silk core that is wrapped around with metal. And tissue specifically is a cloth of gold that has these little loops. They call them bullion loops that are in the fabric. So it's even more metal because you have to create these excess loops. It's not just straight woven back and forth. So cloth of gold tissue is the highest of the elite in terms of cloths of gold and silver. So you could have silver or gold, it didn't really matter. They were both highly prized. And then they also came in different weaves. So you could have just a plain woven cloth of gold. You could have a satin woven cloth of gold. And this they probably would have called branched because of the branches of the design here. So cloth is a term that I try to use carefully when I talk about 16th century fabric because it meant something specific in the 16th century. We have a tendency today to say, oh, I'm making this with some cotton cloth. That would have been very contradictory and strange in the 16th century because cloth specifically refers to wool fabrics, and even more specifically to woolen fabrics, which are different from worsted fabrics in that woolens are the shorter, fluffier fibers from a fleece off of a sheep. And worsteds are the longer, silkier fibers, kind of the cream of the crop of a fleece that will get made into nicer, worsted, thinner, beautiful fabrics, whereas cloth is shorter and fluffier and often will be processed so that it has, it's sort of felted is what we would think of it today. It's called fulling in the period and today, where you weave a piece of woolen cloth and then get it wet and beat it. They have fulling mills that specifically do this process. And the heat and the water cause the scales on the individual wool fibers to open up and mesh with each other to create that sort of felted appearance. Cloth is, even though it might not seem like a luxury fabric like the other fabrics that we've just talked about, it is the backbone of England's economy, beginning in about the 13th century into the 16th century. They are producing a ton of wool, but they aren't necessarily using all of it themselves. They are exporting, at least initially, exporting a lot of the raw wool to the rest of Europe because England just has a great climate for raising good wool producing sheep. So they're exporting the raw fiber to the rest of Europe to be made into fabric. But eventually, England really wants to get even tighter on how they protect their wool industry. So they start manufacturing the wool fabric themselves and exporting it so they don't lose any money. So the only cloth garment that is mentioned for Anne are a couple wool, actually just one of the cloaks mentioned is wool. So it's kind of, the cloth is a sort of a strange outlier in the rest of William Locke's goods. But since it does show up and because England was so important, or wool was so important to England, I did want to include it. Now, what I really love about these accounts is that there are references to clothes for Elizabeth. And at the time of the accounts, Elizabeth would have been just barely 2 years old. But even though she is only 2, like Anne of Austria here, also aged 2, but in 1530, Elizabethan or Tudor children are dressed as tiny miniature adults, especially elite children. You don't ever really have much of what we think of as a childhood today. That's really a late 18th, 19th century invention. Especially for elite children, they are treated as little adults, dressed as little adults. So all of Elizabeth's garments, even though she's 2 years old, are the same types of garments as her mother. She has gowns, kirtles, tartlets, pairs of sleeves, just like her mother. And she has very similar fabrics as her mother, velvet, satin, damask, damask, which if you've ever raised a toddler, I understand she's a princess, but yeah, it's pretty wild. Her colors are very similar, but she does have a couple extra thrown in here. And these are by no means unusual in the palette of 16th century clothing. You can see there are extant examples here of the cloth, or excuse me, the fabric, both as a fabric piece and as a contemporary garment. So this one is the back of a man's robe, which again is probably very familiar to us. We think of that Henry VIII, very square shoulder look. Green is interesting because it's actually difficult to get green dye from a single source and have it be vibrant and color fast. It fades very easily. So what they most often do is use a 2-step process where they dye it with woad or indigo first, and then over dye it with weld, which will produce yellow. And I always thought it was interesting to do blue first, then yellow, because I would have usually gone yellow, then blue, but it's almost always blue first and then yellow when they're dyeing to make green. And so these colors, specifically green and yellow, also show up in the Great Wardrobe between 1485 and 1520. So they're still fashionable, desirable colors, just not nearly as common as the other ones there, but they do show up. So that is the end, and I would be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
No.
That's a great question. I've never weighed it. I've never weighed myself, but you are welcome to like take a handful of it. It is different though when it is distributed on your entire body. And I think that's kind of the great thing about having supportive underlayers is that they help support everything on your body. But I will say that my shoulders get very tired. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, this is literally just from this one section of time and at the very end of her life. So if we had records from earlier, it could definitely show earlier as well. And it did show up in for Elizabeth. So it's a color that she's clearly aware of and still purchasing. Yeah. That, yeah. So that's one of those things that is like unspoken. And so we frustratingly don't have a ton of their, things left. But when we think about the idea of being on the rag, it really is using linen to create yourself a clout, which is what they're calling diapers throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. There is suggestions that women are also using linen cloths as tampons, an internal way to maintain menstrual flow, but they tend to be more of like a clout type garment. Yeah.
Yeah. Someone asked, weren't most non-royals wearing fabric dyed with gold, aka blue?
Blue tends to be more of a household associated color in terms of servants, I guess is really the association. So you don't see it very much as a fashion color. It can be a livery color. So again, high-ranking servants, not necessarily your average servant, but good households, noble households tend to use blue a lot for that purpose.
I'm not sure if you remember, but someone asked, what was the word you were saying with woad to make something true black?
Oh, there's madder.
Madder?
Possibly. Oak gall.
Oak gall. Okay. Someone wondered where they came up with green sleeves.
So interestingly enough, there's a group of scholars and makers who are undergoing what they're calling the Green Sleeves Project. So green sleeves are not the only thing mentioned in that song. There's a whole outfit mentioned in that song, and they are recreating every single piece. I believe that research actually shows that that Henry VIII didn't actually write green sleeves. So it is not contemporary to Anne or Henry. It's most likely a later 16th century song. And funnily enough, you see green show up more often later in the 16th century. I can think of a number of portraits off the top of my head that show green, whereas it is much less common in this period. So I think there's probably a connection there. And actually, for this project, they're making the gown to the 1580s.
How hot do you down in summer? What did they do to adjust to the very hot weather?
Well, the biggest difference is that not only are we dealing with climate change right now, they were also living through a little ice age during the 16th century. So the climate was so much cooler then than it was now. And they were much more concerned with keeping warm than they were with staying cool. I don't think staying cool was a need very often, especially for people of this class who were not laboring outside. And you see so many references. I didn't even go into furs in this, but many of Anne's garments are fully lined. with fur. So the concern is much more about keeping warm because of that. So you could have, the idea would be that this gown was actually fully lined in fur. I only edged it in fur because it would just be ridiculous to wear. And when you think about, and I'm sure Tom and Brigitte can attest to this, in these houses, which don't have central heating, if you are even in the palaces, it is difficult to stay warm. So you're using this as your own personal heating. So our climate, and I deal with this at work when I'm outfitting interpreters to wear 17th century clothing in a completely different climate. And that is the main difference, is they just didn't really have to deal with that in the same way that we do. Yeah.
Is there an active trade of wool to Italy? Or so, like between Italy and England, was there an active trade of fabrics?
That's a good question. I don't know that it was necessarily Italy. I think it mostly went to what they call the Low Countries. So the Netherlands, they seem to be more wool producers. They certainly could have sent it to Italy, either as finished product or raw goods, because there are a lot of weavers in Italy, but they tend to focus on silk.
Someone asked how long it would take for, let's say, Anne Boleyn's dress to be made.
Oh, to be made. Well, the thing about garments during these time period, any of these fitted outer garments are made by tailors. So dressmakers just don't exist in the 16th century. Women won't start making women's clothing until the end of the 17th century, when a whole new style of gown comes in called the mantua. Up until then, tailors make women's clothing, men and women's clothing. And tailors, especially at the level of someone like Anne, the tailors for her aren't working alone. They're going to have a whole workshop of people working underneath them. So they could certainly get things out very quickly, probably in a matter of a few days. Even hand sewn, because a lot of this construction is very, there's long seams here, but you can do that quickly. It doesn't have to hold up to a lot of stress the way things in the bodice do. But yeah, you're not working like we most think of ourselves working at home alone on our sewing machine. They have a whole workshop of folks.
Would Bruges silk be warmer than regular silk?
Actually, I would think silk would be, I find silk to be more inflative than wool. I think wool tends to be more breathable than silk, but I think it's debatable. I think they're fairly similar. Even today, when you shop for base layers, they have merino base layers, they have silk base layers, so they have similar insulating properties.
Would they have things to warm their hands?
Yes, so they do have muffs during the time period. You can also, so these sleeves here are just pinned up. You can undo the sleeves and completely, I have it tacked to stay there, but you can completely undo the sleeve and just tuck your hands into it.
And then how long would it take to get into like the fanciness of dresses?
So this probably is maybe not in materials, but the style is consistent. And I think it took me about an hour to get dressed yesterday. And that's me dressing myself.
So with a bunch of things.
So with help, yeah, it would probably take half that time.
And then I think the last question, unless I missed something, was how is it that the velvet, I guess, is cut? Like
someone has to cut it. Yeah.
Wow, the little scissors.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably with a razor.
Yeah.
That would be easier. But yeah, someone has to cut it. So that's why it is literally undercloth of gold is the most expensive fabric.
Well, I think that's it.
Okay. Was there another?
Could you repeat, yellow was made with what?
Blue is woad and weld. Weld is the yellow. Yeah. And that is another plant dye. Yeah.
How many times do they change clothes during the day?
That's a great question. I don't think that I've ever looked into that specifically, but I would certainly think activity-wise, especially at this class, depending on what you're doing, you could probably start, in that nightgown for morning lounging around, getting ready type things. But I think it would be dependent on what your schedule is. Right. Yeah, exactly. You have to put that in. But I think that's why both king and queen or people of that rank being part of the
their household who dresses them and assists them in dressing is a very privileged position. So you are physically very close to the monarch. You're doing something very intimate for them. So if Anne or anybody has ladies in waiting and they're choosing them to be mistress of their wardrobe and to assist them with dressing, they're not picking an average servant to help them get dressed. It is a position of privilege. So that time gets used wisely, which I think, it takes a lot of time. You literally have the ear of the queen while you're dressing her.
Thank you, Samantha.